Hello, I'm Amanda Thomas, and you are listening to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar, where you can hear recordings of talks given at Science on Tap, a series of events held in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. In this episode, we'll hear from Dr. Marcia Bjornerud about her book, Timefulness, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World. She spoke in Portland at the Alberta Rose Theatre in September 2018. Marcia is a professor of geology and environmental studies at Lawrence University in Wisconsin, and this talk is about how thinking in terms of geologic time can help us get a better sense for how to approach present environmental problems. She encourages us to shift our perspective and to think about the entire history of our planet so that we can understand how what we're doing right now can have effects that will last for millennia. In addition to her talk, stick around at the end for a few questions from the audience. Also, I'll include links to her book and Marcia's other writing in the episode description. With that, here we go.
Microphone is yours. So you're sure you're Earthlings? For children who grow up in wintry climates, few experiences in life will ever elicit the same pure joy as a snow day. School is canceled. The tyrannical rule of the adult world is repealed. Time itself seems suspended. For a short time, everyone concedes to the greater authority of nature. I remember one particular snow day when I was in the 8th grade. About a foot of snow had fallen in the night, and there were fierce winds and then frigid temperatures. But in the morning, I couldn't resist going out and seeing how the world had been transformed. I trudged through the heavy snow and thought I saw a bright red splotch on a branch. I approached it and realized it was a cardinal. I got closer still and realized it wasn't moving. And then, with fascination and revulsion, realized it was frozen on the branch. It was as if time itself had been frozen, and I was able to see something that would normally be a blur of motion. Later that day, back inside the house in the cozy warmth of our home, I remember pulling down our family world atlas. It was one of these giant things, really unwieldy, couldn't really be held comfortably in your lap, and paging through it somewhat listlessly. And I came to a 2-page fold-out of world time zones. The map was laid out in mostly longitudinal stripes of alternating pastel colors. But there were a few areas that were colored gray, and in the legend it said these places had no official time. They were Antarctica, Outer Mongolia, and a place I'd never heard of before, Svalbard. The idea that there were places where time was still somehow not shackled by minutes and hours and ran freely, or maybe was frozen like the cardinal on a branch, fascinated my 14-year-old mind. I next encountered Svalbard after being dragged by my parents to an exhibit of Scandinavian photography in Minneapolis, and I wasn't particularly interested in most of the predictably moody black and white images, but some of them, including this one, caught my attention. They were from an ill-fated expedition to Svalbard in 1897 by 3 Swedes, no comment. But no one knew what had happened to this expedition until 30 years later, when the wreckage was encountered just by accident, and the film that was still in the cameras was developed, documenting the disaster and the slow demise of the participants. This just reaffirmed my idea that this place, Svalbard, was somehow outside time. It was timeless. As it happened, I would end up doing my PhD work in Svalbard on the tectonic history of the northernmost extension of the Appalachian Caledonide mountain chain. And I quickly found out that the no official time designation was nothing as romantic as I had imagined, but instead was a long-running spat between the Norwegians and the Russians about whether to use Oslo or Moscow time there. I also found out that, in fact, the place was not timeless, but timeful. It had a memory of so many different periods of time. When I first started working there in the 1980s, it was still the Ice Age. The Pleistocene was very much present. There were whale bones from the 17th century when Dutch blubber rendering stations were dotted up and down the coast. There were 17th century graves of Russians from the time of Catherine the Great, when being sent to Svalbard was a slow death penalty. There were remnants of 19th century miners' and trappers' huts, one of which we actually stayed in, the very eerie wreckage of a Luftwaffe plane, and once in a while, high up in the mountains, we would find weather balloons that had fallen down to Earth over the last few decades. I began to feel that all of these past times were equally proximal and palpably present. In a place like Svalbard, where there's so little recent human clutter, it's easy to start feeling connected to other times. But in fact, all places are like that. The natural world is bursting with backstories, if we can only see them. But we live in a time-illiterate society. We'd be shocked if an educated adult had no idea where the continents were on a world map. Yet we don't think much of the fact that most people really have no sense of the geography of deep time. I suspect that you Portlandians, with Mount Hood looming over you and the Cascadia subduction zone rumbling beneath your feet, are more in tune with Earth's natural rhythms. But as a society, we are time deniers. Indeed, we're chronophobes. We fear time for a variety of reasons. There are, of course, the young Earth creationists who are easy to make fun of. But occasionally, I do have students who are earnestly grappling with trying to reconcile their deeply held religious beliefs and their study of geology. And to help them with this conundrum, I do have a thought experiment for them. Early in an intro geo class, students learn that rocks are not just objects, but in fact verbs. They're records of processes. And when you start thinking that way, you see that those rocks record long periods of time, the time it takes for a coral reef to accrete or a mountain to grow. And so I asked them, what is more heretical? The idea of a very old Earth set in motion 4.5 billion years ago that evolved gradually over time into what we see today, or a deceitful creator who put every evidence of an old Earth in every nook and cranny, every fossil bed, every zircon crystal we might happen to date in order to deliberately trick us into thinking the Earth is very old. And the students have to answer that question for themselves. Another strategy I have, but it has to be deployed very tactfully, is that, in my view, the scientific understanding of the great antiquity of the Earth and the complexity of Earth's story is awe-inspiring. And the literal reading of Genesis is a very disrespectful dumbing down of that story. For those who deliberately plant misinformation on the web and open places like the Creation Museum in Kentucky, though, I have no patience. They're poisoning the minds of the next generation and muddying the waters at a time where we urgently need a more Earth-literate citizenry. And I'm always shocked at how vigilant and ferocious these young Earth creationist types are. I encountered it again this week. A short excerpt from my book is available on Nautilus, the online science magazine, and within hours, the comments section got co-opted entirely by these young Earth types. It's really kind of amazing. Clearly, there's a lot at stake for them because they're there pouncing almost immediately. But there are other types of chronophobia or time denial that pervade our society. Our natural angst about our inevitable aging and death has become toxically entangled with vanity through capitalistic messaging in a society that is obsessed with youth. So we, as people, individually fear and loathe our timiness. Also, have you noticed that we more and more often tend to refer to ourselves as consumers, as if that's some kind of synonym with citizens, and as if our main job is to devour everything in sight in the manner of locusts, rather than holding each other up and helping to look forward into the future. We are locust-like in our insatiable appetites for the newest iPhone, or the latest app, or the meme of the moment, and have the illusion somehow that we've now outgrown the natural world. There is a new series of essays published by the novelist Amitav Ghosh, who normally writes fiction, but I don't know if people have encountered this book before. I found it a very provocative meditation on the fact that so far, serious literature has not really addressed the central issue of our time, which is climate change. Ghosh points out that many social advancements from the end of slavery to the close of the colonial period were catalyzed in part by good fiction, by good literature. But he's making the point that so far his fellow novelists have not found a way to address this most pressing need in our time. He argues that we don't have an appetite collectively for stories that do not focus on individual human protagonists, and challenges novelists to reimagine literature that can be collective and have the natural world as a central, not just plot point, but actually, an agent within the stories. And I agree, I think that this is part of our problem, that we have trouble conceiving ourselves as a collective these days, and we need to engage not only scientists, but storytellers in that process. His title really has two meanings. One is the derangement that we've caused nature, and the other is our own derangement in thinking that we're outside nature, and that somehow our own stories can go on without the larger narrative of nature. But science itself is partly to blame as well. Have you ever noticed that in the hierarchy of science, those at the apex, physics and chemistry, are really the timeless ones? They're the pure sciences. And by implication, the ones that reek of time, like geology and biology, are impure. There's no Nobel Prize in geology, though there is one in economics, which always stings a little bit. And although I certainly respect the work of other sciences, and geology is a very hybrid science, we need to take we steal from other sciences. We need physics and chemistry and biology to understand the evolution of the Earth. It is true that many of our environmental problems that we face now are the result of people in the non-timey sciences not thinking through the implications of unleashing different technologies in a world that is complex and will evolve over time. So things like the internal combustion engine, fertilizers, plastics, these are things that 50 or 80 years ago, people who had no idea would profoundly change the very nature of the planet. So a little bit of geologic thinking would behoove all of us, scientists and fiction writers and citizens alike. But I think geology itself is partly to blame for failing to convey the important ideas behind geologic thinking. First of all, geology is a bit of a late bloomer. It really didn't come of age until the 1960s when Marie Tharp and others finally figured out that the Earth has a very mobile skin, the tectonic plates. And that was largely due, well, it was partly due to technological barriers, but also to the obtuseness of some mid-20th century geologists who were unwilling to look at the strong evidence that continents did in fact move. It also, I think, our field has overemphasized the antiquity and the slowness of Earth. I'm sure you've all heard this analogy that if all of geologic time were a 24-hour period, humans would suddenly appear in the last fraction of a second before midnight. And I find that a wrong-headed way of thinking about our place in time. First of all, it's very alienating, but it also denies the very deep evolutionary root that we have on the planet. Certainly our own species is a relative latecomer, but our ancient relatives have been around since about 6 a.m. It also denies or kind of removes the responsibility of what we have done in the last fraction of a second. It suggests that nothing we do could possibly make much difference if 23 hours, 59 minutes, and some seconds had elapsed before we ever walked on the scene. It sort of absolves us of what we're doing to the planet now. Furthermore, the Earth really isn't so sluggish as those of you who live in this very tectonically and geologically active part of the world know. The Earth actually has many tempos, some slow, some so fast it takes our breath away. Moreover, there are some unfortunate asymmetries in Earth processes. Evolution is slow, extinction is fast. Usually, cooling the climate is slow, warming it up is fast. Groundwater takes centuries to accumulate and can be depleted in years. So we haven't really, I think, been very nuanced in the way that we communicate to the public about what the essential ideas of geologic time are. And finally, geology is kind of a PR problem, I acknowledge. It's either associated in people's minds with musty museum collections or maybe rapacious oil and mineral companies. And those are aspects of the field, but really don't embody the way I think most geologists feel about what they do. And so, like many geologists, I found the field almost by accident. I remember having an early fascination as a first or second grader with Surtsey, a new island that was born off the coast of Iceland in the 1960s, and seeing an old black and white movie in class about these spires of steam and ash that were being shot into the air as this new island was being created. It awoke this sense in me that the Earth was alive, that there was this throbbing heart in it, and perhaps planted an early seed in my mind that geology was my destiny. But 10 subsequent years of abysmal school science and not a single female mentor, I think, drummed out of me any idea that I myself could become a scientist. And so it wasn't until college that I happened to take an introductory geology class with rather low expectations. Everybody called it rocks for jocks. And so I found to my surprise that it was an intellectually vibrant discipline that required a kind of whole brain thinking that I had never really known about before. I had sort of a humanities bent, and I saw that some of the habits of scholarship that are valued in the humanities, especially close reading of texts, were exactly what geologists did with rocks and landscapes. It rigorously used cognate sciences like physics and chemistry to understand unruly things like volcanoes and glaciers and oceans. And it seemed more than anything to be sort of the etymology of the world. It had just huge explanatory power. So I was hooked. And I feel very lucky that I fell into this field almost by accident. I think that geology feeds the mind and the soul. It's a strange hybrid of the pragmatic, it helps us find resources, but also the philosophical and even spiritual. We ask deep questions. Where did we come from? Why are things the way they are? And it's as much about the past as it is about the future. And I think that's probably the most important idea I'd like you to go home with today. We're talking about the geologic future here. Having worked with people from all over the world, of many different cultures, many different ages, people I probably would never have encountered in any other walk of life, I have perhaps some naive optimism that if more people could conceive of themselves as earthlings, we might be able to get down to business and attend to the things that really matter. One way to describe the way geologists think is the metaphor of a palimpsest manuscript like this one. So I don't know if people have heard of the word palimpsest. It's not really in everyday use. But it's a powerful idea. So in medieval times, before paper, most texts were written on parchment, which was laborious to produce. You had to kill an animal, you had to skin it, you had to dry the skin, you had to scrape it. And so you would often reuse those parchments. So a palimpsest text is one that had been inked and then scraped off and then re-inked at least once. But almost inevitably, some vestige of the earlier writing would remain. And so you can actually often reconstruct whole other texts underneath more recent ones. In fact, most of the works of Archimedes are known only as these palimpsests, which can be seen with X-rays, for example. But that's exactly the way we think about the Earth. When you start realizing that the Earth is a text that's been written and rewritten over again and again, you can't stop thinking that way. Here's a nice example of a river in Argentina that's been meandering all over the place, and you can see the scars and the vestiges of the former positions of the channel quite obviously. But we can see further and further back in time, and so that's the way I like to describe what a geologist sees. And so when I think about Wisconsin, where I live now, I often feel like I don't just live in Wisconsin, I live in many Wisconsins. There are the forests that are still recovering from 19th century clear-cutting. There are the rivers that dictated pre-European trade routes, and the rivers themselves were shaped by the deposits left by Pleistocene glaciers. There are golden sandstones that are memories of an ancient Paleozoic sea that lapped up against the central part of Wisconsin. And there are contorted gneisses that are the deep roots of ancient mountain belts. This polytemporal way of thinking, you could call it, is something that enriches one's understanding of being alive on Earth. But I realize it's a bit of an anomaly. The French philosopher Bruno Latour, who's written a lot about what modernity is, has argued that we moderns have a peculiar propensity for understanding time that passes as if it were abolishing the past behind it. And we feel separated from earlier times by epistemic ruptures so radical that nothing of the past remains. This idea of disruption has been embraced even in the last 10 years as something that's intrinsically good and necessary, but it is ultimately alienating. It cuts us off from earlier times. So this idea that the past is burned up behind us is itself a kind of epistemic rupture from previous times. In most pre-modern cultures, the past hovered over the present. Ancestors could be summoned. In the Norse worldview, there was the idea of Vyrd, it's W-Y-R-D, which meant something like fate, but it really had to do with the power of the past to reach out and shape the present and the future. It was embodied by Yggdrasil, the world tree that held up the cosmos, and Yggdrasil was tended by the three Norns, these mysterious female creatures who represent the past, the present, and the future. In many other traditions, there are complex relationships with time. In the Ghanaian tradition, there is the Sankofa bird. I'm sure many of you have seen this symbol, which is associated with the proverb, "It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten." In other words, move forward, but don't forget the past. And even the Buddhist term sati, which is usually translated as mindfulness, means something closer to memory of the present. And so all of these traditions and many others suggest that people in the past had a much more nuanced understanding of time than our current, rather simplistic, linear one. Luckily, our exile from the past is entirely self-imposed. The past is here. It's in every cell in our body. We are evolutionary legacies of millions and billions of years. The soils, the water, the landscapes that we rely on also are products of billions of years of unfolding. You might think, well, does it really matter if people think of the world around them in that way? So what? I'm perfectly fine existing on this temporal plane. But I think it does matter, because time blindness can lead to some really dangerous illusions, like the idea that we could find a silver bullet solution to climate change in climate engineering, or the idea that we might terraform another planet when this one becomes uninhabitable. Those ideas arise because of the belief that we can short-circuit evolution and long-term change, and they are dangerous ones. The development of the geologic timescale is truly one of the great intellectual achievements of humankind. But it wasn't a single brilliant genius who came up with the idea, so it's kind of an unsung accomplishment. Part of my book is trying to demystify, for those who are interested, how on earth we've been able to reconstruct Earth's history. And it's really a remarkable thing how much detail we actually know about even very distant times. It's still a work in progress, but especially in the last 20 years or so, with the advent of very high-resolution dating of this very special mineral, zircon, we've been able to put very precise ages on even some of the most dim, distant events in the history of the Earth. I also wanted to mention that there are some illustrations in the book that were done by a student of mine who took an intro geo class. She was a studio art student, but she did such remarkable drawings of fossils during one of the field trips that when it came time to think about illustrating this book, I thought of her, and so these are hers, Haley Hagerman. I understand that thinking about geologic time and billions of years, as Carl Sagan used to say, can just be off-putting or alienating or diminishing. But I think there it's useful to make a distinction between two kinds of time that the Greeks had. There was chronos, which is just the raw number, billions of years. And then there's kairos, which means time within a narrative. And when you start filling the billions of years of Earth's history in with the stories in stories in stories, then it becomes something that engages us. We can empathize with the many earlier versions of Earth. It's not just the age, it's the amazingly dense and rich narrative of that long expanse of time. For me, it would be far more terrifying to contemplate a 6,000-year-old Earth with a very short story. It would be like being on a trans-Pacific flight with nothing to read. But luckily, we'll never run out of reading material. It's a long, complex, mysterious story. So what does all of this have to do with saving the world? I would like to say two disclaimers about the subtitle. First of all, by world, I don't mean the Earth. I mean the world, the comfortable infrastructure that we have built and enjoy. The Earth, we can do a lot of damage to it, but it'll be fine. We can bring a lot of other ecosystems down with us, but the planet will survive us. Secondly, and totally off the record, the subtitle wasn't my idea. I have a Scandinavian sense of understatement, but then I started thinking about it, and actually I do think thinking like a geologist can help save the world. At least it's a necessary first step. We have to start thinking on longer timescales. But just when that is more urgent than ever, our attention spans are shrinking. We have few mechanisms in our economic, social, and political systems for long-term, large-scale planning. Wise governance is too often undercut by the 2-year congressional cycle. Corporate decision-making more and more is marching to the tune of the demanding shareholders who want good annual or even quarterly reports. So sadly, for large-scale planning, it really comes to either authoritarian governments or foundations founded by the super wealthy to be looking out for the rest of humanity. And while some of these organizations are doing very good work, this is also deeply undemocratic. We need to re-democratize the future. And too often these days, we have leaders who are engaging in such anti-scientific, magical thinking that it makes medieval worldviews look positively enlightened. Let me share you a particularly vexing example from Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is a water-rich state. We're bounded by 2 Great Lakes. We have lots of smaller interior lakes dotting the landscape. We have many mighty rivers and aquifers that have generally provided us with plenty of clean, fresh water. Until quite recently, the State Department of Natural Resources would permit high-capacity wells only in places where the natural replenishment rates would be commensurate with the withdrawal rates that were proposed. It's quite rational policy. But last year, our state attorney general, after the DNR ruled that it would not issue a high-capacity well permit for a new industrial dairy complex, ruled that that decision had to be struck down because the DNR had previously issued a permit to a nearby dairy operation. Well, the logic of the DNR was we can't have two of these high-capacity wells sited close together because the aquifer will be drawn down. But the Attorney General said, that's not fair, and struck down the DNR's decision and allowed this other dairy to open, and thereby proclaimed that neither the past nor the future were really relevant. All that mattered was now. The tragedy, of course, is that the damage to the aquifer will outlast this particular administration by many decades. Like many people who have been either children or parents in the last 50 years, I love Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are. And I think of the book often when I teach a course called History of Earth and Life. It's really kind of an absurd thing to even undertake. We have 10-week trimesters, and so I have to fit 4.5 billion years into 10 weeks. Usually I make it to the present. Sometimes I don't time myself well. But every year when I teach this course, I feel that I've been on a long journey with the students. And Where the Wild Things Are is really a book about the power of the imagination and how we can save ourselves from our worst selves. And I think the same thing happens when I teach History of Earth and Life. We have been through this long journey. We see many other versions of Earth, alternate ecosystems, bountiful times and bad times. Finally, we start approaching the present, and like Max's room that slowly sheds its vines, revealing his bed and his nightstand, we start recognizing the modern world emerging from the mists. And again, I think that if more people could take that journey and begin to see ourselves as products of this deep, long evolutionary path, maybe, just maybe, we could spring ourselves out of the polarized, antagonistic trenches that we've dug for ourselves. This habit of timefulness is maybe something like many of you experienced last year during the total solar eclipse. That moment when you felt like you were embedded in the cosmos. It's also what Freud used to call that oceanic feeling. If we can hold that in our minds, maybe it would change our relationship with nature, with our fellow humans, and even with ourselves. It would save us from the worst environmental hubris. In recognizing the historical happenstance in each of our lives, maybe we would develop more empathy for each other. And it might even make us a little less neurotic about the fact of our own mortality. In the last sentence of Origin of Species, which is a long one with a semicolon and a whole bunch of commas, Darwin said, "There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." We have always been part of that grandeur. We have just tormented ourselves with the idea that we have been kicked out of the garden. There's a teaching by an 18th century rabbi, Simcha Bunim, that speaks to me, a very lapsed, deeply agnostic Scandinavian Lutheran. It goes, you should always carry 2 slips of paper. One in your left pocket that says, "I am ashes and dust." And one in your right pocket that says, "The world was made for me." Both are true. And so between the poles of existential despair and narcissistic self-absorption, I think there is a path back to the center of the cosmos. But our snow day is ending now, and it's time to grow up and make up for so much lost time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But now I'm going to ask for some lights so I can see these beautiful people out there, because it is time for Q&A. So who's got some questions?
I don't want to put you on the spot, but you did write the book, and that is your title. One of the things that I've struggled with is I feel like we've kind of disassociated environmentalism from who really is going to suffer. You touched on it a little bit, and so we tend to think, or people tend to think of environmentalism as saving the planet when it's really saving us. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how to remessage that. Like, how do we refocus?
That's a great question, and something I really do think about a lot. I mean, I believe nature is intrinsically something worth preserving, but I also recognize that's a luxury that we probably cannot pursue. And I do think that the environmental movement has gone wrong and let the message become so politicized that it's going to be hard to get it back. So I think the message really should be, this is about us. This is about preserving some kind of quality of life. It's going to be a slow erosion of quality of life over time unless we start taking some action. And it's not like an earthquake. It's something it's hard for people to see when it's playing out in slow-mo. But I think, this year with the fires and in the last couple weeks with the hurricane, little by little the message is coming, and in spite of the leadership at the federal level, maybe from the grassroots, people are starting to say, this is real, we need to do something.
I have a question here in the front. I'm going to bring you the mic.
Just curious, for educational purposes, I was wondering, as a geologist, do you think the recent events are related to the human-made climate change?
Which events?
The ones you were referring to in the previous statement, hurricanes.
Yeah, so it's always dangerous to point to a particular event and say, yes, that's climate change. Climate is a statistical thing. Weather is what we have. But I think in aggregate, yes, the growing recurrence of really severe drought and concomitant wildfire, the hurricanes in areas that normally do not experience these very large storms. Hurricanes are driven by the heat energy of the ocean. As the ocean temperatures rise, it's just more and more likely that these will happen. So I'm sure you've heard that in the media before. We can't always say, yes, that's climate change. But in aggregate, these things are good evidence statistically that the Earth is changing.
All right, we have a question over here on your left.
In thinking about time, we often transact in time. We sell it to our employer. And if we want to value it in the way you're talking about, we would need to find maybe another way to value it that's not economic. Do you have any ideas for ways to think about time that divest it from the dollar?
That's an interesting question. We all need to support ourselves. But I think, the amazing thing about the human imagination is that we can travel so far, like Max and his boat, over such short periods of time. I mean, we can live very rich interior lives that maximize the time that we have. And I guess that would be my response, and that's my feeling too in being a geologist. My whole experience of the world is kind of enchanted by the multiple versions of a place that I can hold in my mind at a given time. Even if it's a second, I think about it, it's somehow an experience. So I guess we just have to get in that habit of seeing the richness in the world, even if we don't have all of our time at our own discretion.
All right, a couple rows back here, same space.
I just wanted to thank you for the talk, for one. It was almost like mesmerizing, poetic, and I really do have a different appreciation for geology after this, in the sense I really liked the dramatization between the long and slow evolution, which we always think of in geology, and those contrasts of those fast expressions of geology. I never really thought of it in that way. So it was really great imagery and discussion. My question is around the applicability of geology today. I feel like if there is ever a time where geology should be sexy. Maybe it could be now. It's highlighting rapid change in the space that we live and the time we live and how we live. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, and if ever there was a time for, this type of, like you contrast with economics and, there's no prize for geology, but like what kind of ways are there to apply geology in a way that, in a society that only values economics and the bottom line and the present?
Yeah, a good and profound question too. One thing we could do is have really good earth science in our schools. It's just always shocks me. Why aren't we teaching earthlings about their planet in the same way? I mean, it just doesn't have the cachet, I guess, of physics and chemistry and biology in high school curricula. Maybe here in Oregon schools, you're more enlightened. We don't have any kind of systematic earth science offerings in the Midwest. And so we have almost no students coming in the door knowing this is what they want to do. So we're starting late. But, arguably every citizen should really know the way the planet works. And so I think the beginning is much better earth science education than we have. Make it clear this is a rigorous, challenging, needed, versatile field. And it can start with children. That's my best idea.
Other questions? Oh, I see a hand back here.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. So you kind of mentioned some extinction events, and I know that we're sort of in one right now, apparently. And there's been talk of going from, officially recognizing that we're no longer the Holocene, it's the Anthropocene era and all that kind of talk. I wonder what your opinion is on that, and if you think that some sort of thing like that could help maybe wake people up to what we're doing, some way to bring awareness to that issue.
Well, it's hard to know what rates of extinction were in some cases in the geologic past. The dinosaur extinction is the one caused by an asteroid, and it may have been really a short, sharp shock. The others, we just don't know what the denominator in terms of years was, so for number of species per year. And so it's kind of hard to compare what's happening now to things that might have unfolded over tens of thousands of years or even hundreds of thousands of years. But in any case, the rate of extinction of many species is so much higher than it was even 2 centuries ago that it should give us all pause. But it is hard to compare, again, because of the very different denominators in the rates between geologic extinction events and current ones. I think there's much reason to be concerned, but whether we're really looking at something like, say, the Permian extinction is hard to say.
Thank you so much for this talk. We've been using this kind of term "we" as to encompass all of humanity here and the impacts that we will be feeling. I'm also aware that the impacts are not going to be felt across the board, right? So there's it's going to be felt by people differently depending on where they are and especially by their socioeconomic class, right? Can you give some hope to me as sort of an egalitarian that maybe there's some sort of leveling, or is it going to is inequality becoming worse? Which way is the geology driving this?
You're absolutely right. And the great tragedy and irony is that the people who really have very little responsibility for our current predicament are going to be the ones that suffer the most. People living in lower latitude areas and lower altitude areas near sea level who have fewer resources to grapple with the changes are going to be the ones that suffer the most. And the affluent West has more resources and in the main is not living at the kinds of latitudes that are going to bear the brunt of the change. So it's a really tragic irony. I can't say anything more than that.
And here in the front center.
Yeah, great talk. If you could kind of guess at what the average carbon dioxide concentration might be for, say, this century, and would that much leave a mark on the geologic record of the Earth, do you think?
by the end of this century. I think we're headed to something like 550 ppm or higher. It will be recorded in especially lower rates of calcification of organisms that form limestone in the oceans. We may not have any ice caps left to record it, but if there is still snow falling and capturing CO2, it would be recorded in glacial ice. That's the way that we know what past levels of carbon dioxide have been for the last 800,000 years or so. It will leave a mark in the geologic record. And actually, somebody mentioned the Anthropocene. This is already a term that's kind of found its way into popular media. Geologists have adopted it, but we're actually arguing behind the scenes exactly when the Anthropocene started. And one of the arguments is we need to find something in the rock record or maybe the ice record that would allow us to identify that as the starting point, because that's the way we've defined other intervals in the geologic timescale, like the Holocene and the Pleistocene and the Cenozoic and whatever. They have a particular spot on the Earth in the rock record that everybody agrees that's the start. So there will be some kind of record, and people are arguing about what it might look like.
Thanks. So I'm no climate denier or anything. In fact, I've been believing in that the climate's been changing for a very long time. However, I'm curious. I also feel like that we have innovated and brought a lot of change, and as a species, we've adapted our environment. And I heard you say kind of towards the end that it's too late, or we're at the 11th hour, so to speak. Can you speak to this a little bit more? How is it that perhaps some form of innovation isn't going to find its way into a global change?
Some form of what? I didn't hear
innovation.
That. Innovation, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm hopeful that we will find ways, say, to sequester carbon, and we should be pursuing all possible strategies. The book, I actually have a big, long section on possible technologies that range from things that mimic what nature is doing. There are certain types of rocks that are called peridotite. It's very common rock on Earth, but most of it's in the mantle. And when it's exposed at the surface of the Earth, it can react pretty quickly and actually fix CO2 in mineral form. And so there are people I know from University of Oslo, for example, who have completely shifted their focus from studying arcane mantle rocks to seeing whether we could accelerate that process in nature. So I think there may be some ways we can chip away at what we've already done, but at the same time, we urgently need to be just cutting down on our emissions. So I don't see a silver bullet out there. I'm very chilled by some people's idea that we can inject huge amounts of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere and use that as a way of keeping the planet cool, because that is going to be something that once you lock yourself into, you got to do it for a long, long time. And if you ever stop, you're going to have such a ferocious catch-up greenhouse effect that it could be absolutely devastating. And it doesn't, in the meantime, do anything to stop ocean acidification. So I think the idea that there's going to be some single new innovation out there is always a very dangerous idea. We need to be working on many different fronts, curbing emissions while also maybe trying different kind of carbon sequestration strategies. Just the sheer rate of acceleration of the increase in CO2 is shocking. It's my birthday today. I was born in 1962. Yes. And I bring it up because when I was born, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was just under 300 ppm. Today it's 400 ppm. And the rate of rise is still increasing. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm all for good green technologies that maybe will help take some of our legacy of carbon out of the atmosphere, but none of them so far are nearly as efficient as we need them to be. And many of them actually take a lot of energy that you're going to have to generate somehow without putting more CO2 into the atmosphere.
Thank you for a great talk. If there's one thing that you could tell us that we are doing right, what would it be?
I think I've sensed, I want to sense that we've turned a corner in the denial stage. I think people are waking up, and I'm allowing myself to be just a tiny bit optimistic that we're ready to roll up our sleeves. And I think, certainly Portland and some other cities in the West are leading the way. A lot of the change is happening from the municipal level up, or the county level. So I think some things are happening, but it's too late to sit back and think we've done the hard work.
Thank you all for joining us. And Marcia will be signing books in the lobby too. So if you have a book you'd like her to sign, or if you'd like to get a copy, the bookseller's out there.
Thanks for listening. If you've made it this far, I assume you've enjoyed the podcast, and I'd like to ask you for a bit of help. We're still trying to build an audience so we can bring more science to more people, and we need your help in getting the word out. We're on Facebook and Twitter at SciBar Podcast, which is SCIBAR Podcast, and we'd really appreciate it if you could post or tweet about us. Another really helpful thing would be to review us on iTunes. If you're in the Pacific Northwest and would like to come to one of our events, our list of upcoming topics is at our website at scienceontaporwa.org, and that last part stands for Oregon and Washington. You can also find out more about the events on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at scienceontaporwa. As always, I'd like to say a big thank you to my volunteers. They help me run these events, and I would not be able to do it without them. They are Scott Fry, Chris Gowan, Sam Lauk, Rita Nygren, and Steve Perry, and a ton of other people who have helped over the years. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Amber Peoples for hosting this event and for running things for the past few months. Finally, a big thank you to Jonathan Coulton for letting us use his song Mandelbrot Set as our intro and outro music.